Everyone assumes there's a room somewhere, a group of oil executives or maybe a handful of oil ministers sitting around a table deciding what you'll pay at the pump next month. Here's the uncomfortable truth. That room used to exist. It doesn't really work that way anymore. And the fact that most people still think it does is exactly why oil prices feel so confusing, so political, and so impossible to predict. Today we're breaking down who actually moves oil prices, and the answer is a lot messier, a lot more fragmented, and honestly a lot more interesting than some cartel decides. Let's start with the group everyone blames first: OPEC. For decades, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, really was close to that room. A group of oil-rich nations, led heavily by Saudi Arabia, controlling enough of the world's oil supply that they could genuinely move prices just by opening or closing the taps. In 1973, OPEC members cut off oil exports to countries supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and prices quadrupled almost overnight. That single event is basically the origin story for the idea that a small group of oil states controls the global economy's most important commodity. But here's what changed. OPEC's share of global oil production has shrunk significantly over the decades as new producers entered the game. Today, OPEC operates under an expanded coalition called OPEC Plus, which includes non-OPEC producers like Russia, specifically because OPEC alone no longer has enough market share to move prices the way it once did on its own. They need allies now. That alone should tell you something about how much the balance of power has shifted. And even within OPEC Plus, it's not one unified voice. It's a coalition of countries with wildly different economic needs, different production costs, and often quietly competing interests. Saudi Arabia wants prices high enough to fund its government budget, which is enormous. Other members, with smaller reserves and more immediate cash needs, sometimes want to pump more oil right now rather than hold back for a coordinated price strategy. Every time you hear about an OPEC Plus meeting, what's actually happening behind closed doors is a negotiation between countries that don't fully trust each other, trying to agree on production targets that each of them has an incentive to quietly cheat on. So OPEC Plus still matters. A lot, actually. But it's no longer the single hand on the dial. It's more like one player at a much bigger table. Which brings us to the player that completely rewrote the rules over the last 15 years: American shale oil. Before the shale boom, if OPEC cut production to push prices up, there wasn't much of an immediate counterforce. Prices would rise and mostly just stay risen, at least for a while. Shale changed that dynamic completely. Shale wells are fundamentally different from traditional oil wells. They're faster and cheaper to drill, and critically, they can be turned on and off much more quickly in response to price changes. When oil prices rise, American shale producers can ramp up drilling within months, not years. When prices fall too far, they can pull back almost as fast. This turned the United States into what's sometimes called the new swing producer, the role OPEC used to play almost by itself. Except unlike OPEC, American shale production isn't coordinated by any single decision maker. It's hundreds of independent companies, each responding to price signals individually, based on their own costs and their own investors' demands for profitability. Nobody is in a room deciding how much shale oil to produce. It emerges from thousands of separate, decentralized decisions, all reacting to the same price signal at roughly the same time. That's a genuinely strange thing if you think about it. One of the most powerful forces shaping global oil prices today isn't a strategic decision by a government. It's an emergent pattern from a completely uncoordinated competitive industry just doing what makes financial sense for each individual company. Now, let's talk about the part of this story that almost nobody outside of finance really understands. The oil that gets traded isn't actually oil. Most of the barrels that move oil prices day to day aren't physical barrels sitting in a tanker somewhere. They're contracts, futures contracts specifically, traded on financial exchanges by traders who, in the vast majority of cases, have absolutely no intention of ever physically taking delivery of a single barrel of crude oil. Here's how wild this gets. Estimates have suggested that the volume of oil traded on paper through futures and financial contracts can be many multiples of the actual physical oil produced and consumed each day. Pension funds, hedge funds, algorithmic trading firms, banks, all of them buy and sell oil futures as a financial asset, essentially betting on which direction prices will move, completely independent of whether they need any actual oil for anything. This matters enormously because it means oil prices can move sharply based on things that have nothing to do with physical supply and demand in the moment. A rumor about a pipeline outage, a tweet, a surprising economic data release out of a major economy, fear about a potential conflict that hasn't even happened yet. None of that changes how much actual crude oil exists in the world on a given day, but all of it can send prices swinging because so much of the price is being set by traders reacting to expectations, not by anyone physically buying or selling barrels. This is also why oil prices briefly went negative in April 2020. It wasn't that oil became worthless, it's that so many financial contracts were set to expire, forcing traders who didn't want physical delivery to dump their positions at almost any price in a market where physical storage space had also run out. That entire chaotic event happened almost completely disconnected from the actual chemistry or usefulness of crude oil itself. It was a plumbing problem in financial markets, wearing the mask of an oil story. So if you're keeping score, OPEC plus influences supply through coordinated, if leaky, production decisions. American shale reacts to prices in a decentralized, uncoordinated way, and a massive layer of financial speculation sits on top of both of them, moving prices based on expectations, fear, and positioning that may have nothing to do with actual barrels changing hands. We haven't even gotten to geopolitics yet, and this is where things get even messier. A huge percentage of the world's oil has to physically travel through a small number of extremely narrow, extremely vulnerable choke points. The Strait of Hormuz between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is the single most important oil choke point on the planet. A significant share of all seaborne oil passes through it. The Strait of Malacca, near Singapore, is another critical bottleneck for oil headed to Asia. These choke points mean that a war, a military threat, a single incident involving a tanker, or even just heightened political tension in the wrong location can send oil prices spiking on pure fear alone, long before a single barrel of supply is actually disrupted. Markets don't wait for the worst case scenario to actually happen. They price in the probability of it happening instantly, which means geopolitical tension itself functions as a kind of invisible hand on oil prices, completely separate from OPEC, shale, or Wall Street trading desks. Sanctions add another layer entirely. When major oil-producing nations get hit with international sanctions, their oil doesn't necessarily disappear from the world, but it often gets rerouted, sold at discounts to countries willing to buy it despite the sanctions, and shipped through increasingly murky shadow fleets of tankers designed specifically to obscure where oil actually came from. This doesn't just affect the sanctioned country. It reshuffles global oil flows in ways that ripple into prices everywhere, as buyers who used to source oil from one place scramble to secure supply from somewhere else instead. Then there's a piece of this that's almost never discussed outside of economic circles, the US dollar. Oil is priced globally in US dollars. This means that when the dollar strengthens against other currencies, oil effectively becomes more expensive for countries buying it with anything other than dollars, even if the underlying price in dollar terms hasn't moved at all. When the dollar weakens, the opposite happens. So global monetary policy, decisions made by central banks, particularly the US Federal Reserve, about interest rates that have nothing directly to do with oil, end up quietly influencing effective oil prices around the world, simply through currency mechanics. This is a genuinely underappreciated point. You can have zero change in actual global oil supply and demand, and still see oil become meaningfully more or less expensive for huge parts of the world, purely because of what's happening in currency markets thousands of miles away from any oil field. And then there are governments themselves acting unilaterally outside of any OPEC coordination. Strategic petroleum reserves exist specifically so that governments, most notably the United States, can release stored oil onto the market during a crisis, temporarily increasing supply to try to calm prices, or conversely, hold back on releases to let prices rise. This is a political tool as much as an economic one. Releasing reserves ahead of an election, for example, has an obvious political dimension that has nothing to do with market fundamentals. So let's actually answer the question: who controls oil prices? The honest answer is nobody, entirely. And yet, in small, overlapping, competing ways, almost everybody with a stake in energy markets has some influence. OPEC plus nations shape supply through coordinated decisions, but they're constrained by internal disagreements and by producers outside their coalition. American shale companies react individually and rapidly to price signals, adding a decentralized counterforce that didn't exist a generation ago. Financial markets layer a massive, often disconnected speculative dimension on top of physical supply and demand, moving prices on expectations as much as reality. Geopolitical risk at a handful of narrow choke points can spike prices on fear alone. Currency markets quietly shift the effective price for huge portions of the world, and governments, through strategic reserves and sanctions, occasionally step in directly for reasons that are sometimes economic and sometimes very obviously political. Oil prices aren't set. They're negotiated continuously by all of these forces pulling in different directions at the same time, none of them fully in control, all of them influencing the outcome. Which means the next time you see a headline blaming OPEC or speculators or the war in wherever for a sudden spike in oil prices, the honest response isn't to pick one villain. It's to recognize that oil prices sit at the intersection of geology, geopolitics, decentralized capitalism, financial speculation, and currency mechanics, all happening simultaneously all the time with no single hand on the dial. That's not a satisfying answer if you're looking for someone to blame, but it's a far more accurate one than almost anything you'll hear in a 30-second news segment. And understanding that complexity is honestly the closest thing to actually understanding how the price at the pump gets decided.